Hello everyone, today we talk about Romano-Italic aristocracy in late antiquity. So we started this series about medieval Germany and medieval Italy. Last time we made Alemannian and Alpine Reich for Germany. Now start with this for medieval Italy. We will update just, infrequently, but still enough to go a bit more in detail with these two regions. And we have already taken a look at this time in space. We talked about the elites, especially this, and properly the senatorial one. It was the only one in this context. In the late Roman world, we looked at Ostrogothic Italy, for example, at the transition from, let's say, Roman rule, at least from a military point of view, to the Germanic one, and the importance that the Roman aristocracy maintained in the government of the peninsula, even under the Germanic dominations. We've looked at many. Here we have many links that we can. All the videos we made on, the Justinian Reconquest, or the same, Ostrogothic history, or eventually the arrival of the Longobards, to which today we actually stop, exactly because the Gothic War puts an end to Roman aristocracy effectively, right? Italy was faring way better under the Ostrogoths than it was, doing after the Reconquest, for many reasons. But still, it's a bit how it happened in Gaul and in Spain. Like, up to this point, Italy was a bit like them. The Gothic War raises everything to the ground. Properly, the Longobards didn't change much in a negative sense. On the contrary, they actually began to rebuild on a unitary base. That is something remarkable and often misunderstood. We won't talk about that today, but we have to stress here the elite nature of this ruling class, right, that kept existing, and also looking at its characteristics, because if we were, locally speaking, if we were to compare the Latin generally, right, this is true not just for Italy but also for Gaul, for example, as the great center of cultures, right, in the West. There were very different aristocracies from, let's say, what we call the Byzantine one, right? Constantinople had created a very different senate in terms of extraction and also balance of power compared to imperial rule, as you very well know. And part of the consequence was the least, at least at this point in Byzantine history, the least importance, right, also in social status of the same senatorial families, because the emperor had literally a greater control on them, and this was due to the fact that we're less powerful altogether. The Western ones, and especially the Italo-Roman one, was really something different, and the difference is really striking, especially when we see things as the refuge of the same Western aristocracy, the Italian aristocracy in Constantinople after the Gothic War. Here in the pictures, I also inserted some images from the Dioscorides of Vienna, right? That is basically the best image of the extremely highly sophisticated and deeply structured Latin culture that had survived among the Italic elites, in a way that basically, in terms especially of traditionalism and actual closeness to the Roman legacy from a cultural point of view in classical times, was the strongest, right? And there would be so many interesting digressions that perhaps throughout this series we will see better at some point. That is how that this elite was essentially destroyed by the Gothic War, right? They simply they actually were the responsibles for the same war, right? This is a problem that the Visigoths partly also had in Spain, but on a different basis. Today we can't digress also on all these complicated relations, but just we'll try to photograph what it means aristocracy, what it means nobility, right? And this gives us the opportunity to focus so much properly on what also we mean about medieval aristocracy, medieval nobility, and studying the history of Southern Europe in this sense is crucial in so many ways, because in popular culture, I think we created the image of the Middle Ages as, properly the moment of creation of the nobility, right, of the elite. And this is very inaccurate. As we'll see now, basically medieval aristocracy, medieval nobility fundamentally stemmed as a model from the ancient ones, right? And we have stripped a bit the ancient world. We attributed to the Greeks, to the Romans, this allegedly democratic character, especially in the case of the Romans. This is absolutely not true. So that we hysterically like to recon, these modern elements into realities that weren't modern. Were modern in some ways, but not for the reasons that we would like in this sense, and tracing a link with the modern age. This is ridiculous at so many levels. Also because of the prejudice for the modern age, right, and the idea that was kind of a democratic moment as well, while it was basically the consolidation of the ancien regime. But specifically, when we study the Middle Ages, we have this, in popular culture all over the world. Obviously, the images, the pictures, the mental categories in think about in the arts, in literature, in movies, etc. Of essentially of northern, and specifically northwestern European perspective that surely had a very different history from these lands. Where in the Mediterranean there was a dramatic continuity, not just with the models of nobility, etc., but properly with what would also expand in the rest of Europe, and with properly certain aspects of it, such as urbanization, for example. How many times, how many stereotypes do we have about the Middle Ages that actually stem from the idea that the Middle Ages recompose themselves from the within, right, as a thing on its own? Well, today, historiographically speaking, this is a concept that doesn't make much sense anymore. What is the birth of European nobility, right? Pirenne thought, for example, that it was a frankly medieval creation, not antecedent to the 10th century. Others, properly said, connected the nobility properly meant to the chivalric right, to the dubbing. So they looked at the lock of it from as a standard definition of a class, as a ordo, as a stand, during the 12th century. Now these centuries are not random. There is something that was happening there, but they largely, considered that these people largely considered as central in the question the passage from an informal supremacy of the magnates, of notables, a situation in which nobilis instead in Latin means simply in conformity with its etymology, like well known, right, that everybody know. So a nobility de facto, right, to a nobility in a proper and legal sense. So like the Germans say, from Oberschicht to Adel, right, or as the Italians say, from aristocrazia to nobiltà. And in reality, there is a dialectics between a de facto situation and a legal situation, between an informal and institutionalizing, I would say, moment that runs through all the history of the ancient ruling classes up to the end of the Middle Ages. It's a continuous flow, right? We're not willing to say so much that was something like the nobility, as we meant in medieval terms, also in the ancient world. There actually was, right? It was different in the, sometimes in the forms, in the fact, presence of a state or not. But in terms of wealth distribution of power, that is something that was sometimes actually even more elevated than in medieval times, and that is often disregarded for the aforementioned prejudices, for the idea that Rome is democracy. It wasn't at all like that. The Romans would be utterly shocked to be misrepresented in such a fashion, and furthermore, in spite of how much we want to medievalize the category of nobility, it is a fact that the ancient world consigned to the following eras, not just the terminology of nobilis and nobilitas, that is the standard in medieval, in Latin, Latin Germanic Europe, wherever Latin spread actually, as the koine, but also certain traits, right, that would have identified aristocracies also beyond the Middle Ages, right, throughout all of it and also in the modern age. For example, the correspondence between a social supremacy and its foundation in the antiquity of the ancestry. This is, think about the gentes or gentes Romani. I mean, that was Rome properly meant. And so in here, still we see by late antiquity there were gentes that dated back to at least, 700, 800 years before, historically, as such proper. So thus a connection between a biological, literally blood factor, and a social dignity that was defined in terms of nobilitas. Then there is also the idea of a normal connection between nobility and wealth, right? And after all, the sometimes polemical picture of a nobility qualified rather by a cultural or ethical distinction. And finally, there are also some models of connection or link between nobiliar dignity, political power, and public functions. That is actually, at least this is one of the few things that are usually also in popular culture we get right about Rome. That is also, however, in fact neglected instead for the Middle Ages, right? We think that the Middle Ages were just private culture. Well, in part, especially in feudal culture, this is true, but that's not exaggerated. There was always an idea of public authority, an idea of Romanity, right? Of the empire, of the idea of a state. At the end of the day, administration stemmed from a Latin legacy, from Roman law, and from that wasn't even in here dramatically different from the ones of, let's say, in the essence. Let's think about the equality of the freemen, things like that. I mean, those were shared things, but definitely here we're talking about something more mechanical, more advanced, and this existed in the Middle Ages too, and it's dramatically overlooked because that may be just an emotional fact that we like to think the Middle Ages were just about knights with swords. And, this is a military history channel essentially, so we also get pretty interested in that, and I am definitely more sympathetic towards knights sometimes and towards other figures because they attract my the capacities that beyond the technical capacities but speak of the language of a civilization. That unfortunately most people that approach the Middle Ages popular culture have no clue themselves about, that making them close to ancient tribesmen or what the medievals actually were. That was something definitely more advanced and developed and intelligent. And so an interconnection between these, properly, the Romans had the term of munus, that meant both as duty and reward, right? And this is so much at the roots of Western civilization. I mean, the idea that wherever you were, you could, if you deserved it, if you worked, you'd struggle hard, acquire the same rights as others, right? And these rights were exclusively thought at the time. That is to say, yes, we're open to everybody who deserved them in that sense, but that's why they were truly universal, right? And this is something we should stop reflecting. So this is very important to our point here, because this connection opened the possibility to an access to the nobilitas, also without the requisite of the ancestry, antiquity, you could say. So, speaking of Italy, we are looking now at the arc of three generations that sees the peninsula ruled first by Odoacer, the head of the Heruli and other Germanic groups. So this happened between 476 and 489. I mean, Odoacer ruled also before, but at least officially. Then the one of the Gothic kings with the great Theodoric. We made at this point multiple videos on the Ostrogoths, and we'll keep making them because that's a very important and dramatically overlooked chapter of Western history. 489, 526, then eventually his successors, up to the Gothic War, that is nothing but basically the Byzantine reconquest of 550, ended in 553 after basically 18 years. And what is important to stress in here is that during these three generations, the Roman Senate and its administration was there, right? Integrally, right? Aside at the very last years of the war, but throughout all this, the Roman state kept working. All these Germans were not just an endemic minority in a way, but they also left their mark, but they surely were becoming properly, the Goths during the Gothic War were fighting for their own Italy, if you want, right? They were at that point also. It's a complex story because the Gothic nobility was actually split, and and also part of the reason why they lost at the end of the day. But they were there was a society that was confronted with this problem, also in fact of the continuous persistence of Roman elites that were sitting together with the Gothic chieftains at the consistorium of Ravenna in front of Theodoric. But what is important here is to stress it was properly a Roman Senate, the members of which concurred to form properly an ordo, in Latin, a class, if you want, albeit the ordo it's also something conceptually a bit more pregnant, I would say, but it was destined to constitute the model for the aristocracies that dominated European Middle Ages, right? If you take an average medieval source, especially in early medieval times, high medieval times, you have what's the local council of any country? It's called senatus, right? There is no way around, and all this vocabulary naturally was was extended to many other aspects of rule of the administration that were probably a language that that Latin had invented sometimes in its literal meaning, because other societies hadn't had, as we were saying before, that connection, that idea of mootness as others had, right? And the Middle Ages were soaked into this. The Senate of Rome, here Ravenna was the administrative capital, but Rome was continuously the capital. Formally, but also properly, the Senate of Rome remained as one of the most important political bodies in the Western Roman Empire, and the papacy here was a big deal. The first thing Theodoric does when he defeats Odoacer in Ravenna, he goes to Rome and renders homage to the Pope. Consider he was an Arian, right? So that he had also to deal with Catholicism, and he was quite respectful of the Roman elite, both lay and ecclesiastical. It's the same reason why Constantine decided to simply found a new capital with a new senate and a new church elsewhere, right? Because he couldn't properly go against these Roman institutions, or at least he needed more room to build what he had in mind, and that was surely successful, but still replicating the same Roman Senate, and trying naturally to compete with the same Roman Church from a ecclesiastical point of view. That was a bit less successful as an enterprise. So the Senate of Rome in these generations knew, also considering the time, so in a moment in which the Western Roman Empire didn't even exist anymore, but let's say a renewed importance and let's say and respect towards the past. The reasons being the need of legitimization of the new Germanic kings that were surely, as we're saying now, needing the support of these institutions, also in the face of those who had sent them to rule in Italy, in Constantinople, that were surely this looming threat, as the reconquest would also prove dramatically, and also for the same Germanic rulers will to create a cohesion of the elites, right? A joint political direction. You couldn't have half of the country moving one direction, one on the other, right? As you know, the Germans made up the army, right? It was, they literally controlled now all the what had been the Roman army infrastructures, the armory production centers, all these things, right? They were also settled endemically in the key areas such as the Apennine, the Alpine passes, and so on. Whereas the Italo-Romans made up the civilian administration, and they kept ruling a country that up to that point hadn't been destroyed. As we were saying before, it was like Africa, it was like Gaul, it was like Spain. Those were all lands where hadn't no major trauma had factually occurred, right? And Italy is an exception in here, as basically just Britain would undergo that. Like, in fact, the two areas actually display some similarities, such as Gaul and Spain actually show also between each other. But this is once again another topic. So it's in this time that we know something very meaningful about the physiognomy of the Senate and in general of late antique nobilities. Right, so never think the Roman Empire ended in 476, because in 476 nothing happened, like literally nothing, and the Romans went on for other 80 years in the way they had always been, right? With all the changes, of course, had gone on over time. Some very meaningful, but just an example. On the first two files of the Flavian Amphitheaters of the Colosseum, during the reign of Odoacer, the names of the senators were inscribed. And this was to indicate that that sector was reserved to them. So the Roman citizens didn't pay a ticket to assist to the spectacles of the Colosseum, but they entered with a card that indicated that the sector had been assigned to them in function of their office, of their institution, and of the class of belonging. So in the lower steps, so the ones that were closer to the scene, the privileged ones, the emperor and his court, in fact, together with the member, however, of the same Ordo Senatorius, stood. Then immediately above, the seats were reserved to the members of the other great aristocratic group, that was the Ordo Equestris, so the knights. And above, further, there were the spaces destined to the different collegia, for example, to groups also coming from other cities, and naturally to the populace of Rome, right? That Romulea plebs, of which a letter that destined to a noble functionary of the city around 535, so beginning with God of War. The Senator Cassiodorus would have celebrated the sobriety, the quietness, or maybe also the clamor, but without rebellion, as he wrote. Also the strepitus, in fact, the noise, that, however, never, according to him, degenerated into furor, as it was said. So the desire to escape the world order, let's say, because of poverty, or to, let's say, wishing for new riches, right? So obeying to the established order. So this was very important in civilizational terms, because this was opposed instead to the this reflected the pre-order divine perfection of the empire, right? Reflected also in the political and social reality, whereas out of the empire was the barbarity in the sense of lack of rule, of political instability, of who properly didn't understand the need of this order. So in the wide enclosed space of the Colosseum, you could see, therefore, the discrimination of the classes. So in the years we're talking about specifically, it was somewhat polarized, though, because from around 1st century, the equestrian order was de facto disappeared. It had been absorbed in the senatorial one, so much that at that point, and this is perhaps the most meaningful picture we can get, there was just a simple contraposition between the senatorial aristocracy and the plebs, right? And this reflects basically late antiquity, especially in the western half of the Roman Empire, that was less, let's say, dynamic and rich than the eastern one, but still organized historically, in fact, in a different way, where the elite proper was the head now, right? Since the crisis of the 3rd century, the power of the middle classes had gone eroded notoriously. The aristocracy had acquired a greater weight. From Constantinian times, everything had been, tended toward that direction. And what you have here, what characterizes late antiquity from a socio-economical point of view, you have properly these ultra-elite of the senatorial class that own an astonishing amount of estates, right? And where hundreds of thousands live and work, and do not have much of an option to free themselves, because the world has changed, because properly there is not much of another way to live. The surplus is low. These men have literally monopolized the control of the land. There is no way out of that. Many people, of these people that live now as sort of servants, fundamentally, even if when they are freemen, it's because sometimes they had no other choice but to ask for the protection of these great landowners. And this is in many ways also the origin of European nobility, when you look at countries where this system lived on without interruption. In Italy, as we were saying, the Gothic War destroys this. There is a parcelization of wealth, right? Italy actually remains the richest per capita in the world, uninterruptedly, since Roman times to the end of the 17th century. Yes, even after these problems, because now we can't digress too much, but I was making the example with Gaul, where this didn't happen, and this great latifundia, these great estates, basically passed into the hands of the Gallo-Roman, remain actually in the hands of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy that blended eventually with a Frankish one, and hence we have the huge estates and retinues and privatization of political and social culture that is typical of Frankish Gaul, right? Without which you could have not had properly what we know as the vassalic beneficiary system, as feudalism, right? That's how impacting the late antique order was, in a sense, for whether you want to stylicize, stereotype it like this, right? But it was also, let's say, a few other areas in the world could boast properly a more equal distribution of wealth, right? Here it's complicated to explain, also in perspective, depending on when and where we're talking about. It's not today's topic, but still it's very meaningful to understand that there was just a very few people with basically all the wealth in their hands, and the rest just working for them, right? So much that this would present an important limit also to the capacity of integrating Romans and Germans. I mean, that is, as long as this system was instilled, it was not an ethnic problem, right? Because the Goths, for example, in Italy, were trying to do exactly the same with the German freemen, and that's basically what happened. But the problem was that there was an elite with all its power, all its estates. It was basically parallel to the Gothic one. And what do you do about that? It's the same problem in Spain. Same problem in Africa, right? For example, the Arian versus Catholic question was, even in there, had basically nothing to do with religion. It had to do specifically with which group you wanted to side in terms of what kind of model of power also you wanted to obtain, who had to be in charge. The same Gothic War was caused by that. It was basically this Roman elite that was anxious to re-enter the empire, de facto to enjoy the benefits of a decentralized position in the Western Mediterranean, and making money just with their own land, etc. And whereas during Gothic War, this is notorious, also Tautila, for example, destroyed the latifundium in order to free all these servants that worked in them, to give them freedom, to equate them juridically to the Germanic freemen themselves, in order to make mass, to make force, both manpower and labor force during the war. This is something that incidentally would dramatically favor the Longobards, because they arrived in a situation where that order was that the war had simply destroyed the latifundium, so their Germanic society was much more integrable and capable of gaining consensus among these masses of peasantry now, because they were basically proposing them something much closer to them than the latifundium. And that's also part of what the whole deal actually was. So many people from Byzantine Italy eventually literally escaping to go living to Longobard land, because there they would find, much less taxes, first of all, but properly also freedom in juridical terms, and the assimilation there to the Longobard society was full, because basically Romans disappear in the Longobards world, and contrary to what was believed before, when the nationalistic historiography said that because the Romans were marginated, and no, it's because they had all become Longobards, juridically speaking. And this is extremely important. Like, if you get this, like, basically the early Middle Ages is yours, because you can compare the same dynamic in all the post-Roman countries, not only because eventually this Roman element, in the form also of the church and its administration, etc., spread also among areas that, through the same, I don't think about the Franks, we were talking about Alemannia the other day, so that is a good example of that gradual process of integration, of exportation of such models. But so this rigid class distinction went in parallel also with physical proximity, interestingly enough, because here the example of the Colosseum shows people that enjoyed together same, for example, entertainment culture. Say that, by the way, at the time was not so violent as it had been up to a few generations ago, given that the mortal clashes between gladiators had left space more to only to the venationes, right? So the fight with animals, between the animals and the gladiators, that were actually not less bloody, mostly for the poor animals, but sometimes for the gladiators as well. And it seems also that another spectacle, the chariots race in the Circus Maximus, had greater success in this, especially at the end of the 5th century in Rome. So this decline for the taste of bloody games was caused by different factors. We can think about the same atrocity of the civil wars, of the invasions, with the sacks of so many cities, and of the same Rome that in fact was plundered in 410, 455, and 472, and that brought definitely on the fore the image of something, of the real cruelty of reality that was not needed to be spectacularized more than much. That the Romans had these games in which they weren't just for the sake of entertainment, but also for the assertion of the power of the empire themselves. I don't know, if there was a rebel barbarian was captured, was literally offered to the gods of the empire by being devoured alive by wild animals, and that was the assertion of the divine glory of the skies basically permeating the animals for the Romans to devour and to tear apart and to destroy their enemies. And so it was a deep symbological idea. Today, I don't know, I hate cliches and popularizations when, we have to think of, I don't know, ancient games and entertainment as if, we went to see a football match today. It was a completely different experience. It were dramatically deeply rooted political, symbological, religious, military meanings in these activities. It wasn't about the entertainment just for the sake of itself, as we think in a kind of a secularized, from a secularized point of view. Also, another important factor had been naturally the Christian religion that had, as we know, had become official in the empire since the end of the 4th century. That actually was adversed in Rome, and by the same senatorial order, especially more than any other context, at least, especially at this. In terms of the elites of the empire, right? The Roman senators were extremely proud, kind of obviously, about paganism, and would maintain a great deal. Part of their ultra education was connected to this, in the sense that, differently from, the Byzantine senators that had just to learn kind of a synthesis of some Hellenic and Roman works, these Romano-Italic senators were, truly ultra educated. They had the complete standard pack of higher education you could find around the whole empire, right? And just because they belonged to that family and they were educated like that, there was no other way around, right? Because this went in parallel, naturally, also with a lot of administrative, juridical, oratory culture. All something that they had to use actively to rule, to manage, to govern, right? So, but it was deeply imbued with lots of other values that gravitated around properly the Latin dimension of the West, as opposed to the Hellenic one of these. We can approximate like that. I say this because literally here, of course, when we talk about Italy or Gaul or Spain, we're talking about different realities, and also talking about the Eastern Roman Empire even more, in a sense, because it was more complicated. The West was more territorial, right? Where it's also easier to identify these countries. The East is something different because, say, Greekness was something sometimes like a dot in a coastal city, and the interland was more complex, and there hadn't been, major chunks of people. It was a very mixed, situation. But specifically here we're talking about Latin culture from a written literary point of view, and Greek culture. There are very different things, right? So, because they also were used at this time in very different ways, right? But this is also maybe for another topic. You would be surprised to know. This is maybe another aspect, but nothing. Just memories from paleography exams, the codicology exams could come back useful at some point. So, in the same time in which the simplification of the division of Roman political aristocracy between senatores and equites, with the fusion of a unique ordo senatoris, such ordo had been articulated internally according to a hierarchy of 3 ranks, right? At the base there were the clarissimi, then the spectabiles, and at the top the illustres. The latter were the only ones that could be called senators in a proper sense, because they were the only ones who had the right to participate to the work and the decisions of the Senate, and punctually in the dispositions of the seats in the Colosseum, the viri illustres, so the lowest file, the viri
spectabiles and the viri clarissimi were distinguished. Right? And the latter were, in first place, sons of senators, to whom a principle of hereditary conferred automatically the clarissimatus. To the viri clarissimi were reserved a series of offices in urban and imperial administration of very high profile ones, and after a period of permanence in various offices, that is, having carried out the cursus honorum, the vir clarissimus entered the Senate, and it reached the rank of illustris. In parallel with this hereditary path, during late Roman times, another one had affirmed itself, that basically granted the access to the local magnates and of homines novi, so even of people of lesser status, to the senatorial order. High administrative offices could be conferred by the emperor also to people who were not part of the Senate. Their exercise automatically entailed the attribution of the rank of clarissimus, spectabilis, illustris in function respectively of the level of the office. And bearers of the higher qualification were the prefect of Rome, the prefectus urbi, and let's say the higher officials of the royal court, we could say at this point of Germanic rule, residing in Ravenna, that is the prefect of the Praetorium for Italy, and a few other dignitaries. This is important because imperial power here is just in the east, but such offices had remained in previous times, and also this is especially even in the Eastern Roman Empire. It was normal for the emperor to co-opt whatever they really wanted at the end of the day. So much was their power increased also in turn, just like the aristocracies compared to previous Roman times. And this was naturally a way also to check the power and ambition of the two dangerous families at that point. But let's say that the rigid correspondence between public offices and social ranks entailed thus an apparent paradox, that is, a mobility that was driving away gradually from the mere game of hereditary. And the arbiter in this mobility was, in fact, the emperor, that could attribute the highest offices to homines novi, that is, even non-noble people that were extraneous to the senatorial order, and he could candidate them to the Senate, where never, his proposal of cooptation would have ever been rejected, right? And on the other hand, it was necessary for that cooptations to the Senate could not be proposed by the same senators of the imperial assent, right, with the objective, naturally also at that point, to favor the senatorial friends and clients, but still with the imperial consensus. So if the steps of the Colosseum show clearly in this relatively few years the distinction between senators and people, the, let's say, triple hierarchy within the Ordo Senatorius, the letters and the formulas written by Cassiodorus for the Gothic kings of Italy address more than once this dialectic of hereditary and cooptation with imperial intervention, because even if it was a matter of more liberal conservative attitude regarding to who could enter the system and therefore could make politics at that point. And the greater emphasis from these sources in the sense of hereditary nobility, right? And thus in the hereditary right to the offices. This is very important, and it photographs pretty well the weight of the established traditional aristocracy in Italy at this point. So, for example, the letter with which in around 510 Theodoric himself presents to the senators Importunus of the great lineage of the Decii, opens remembering how gratified the emperor is to rise to the honors, say personas novas, so new people, but even more to attribute the same honors to people that are already illustrious by blood, right? In their origin is glory by itself, right? The Romans literally believed that these families were like, this is basically what was believed all over the world, that if a family had ruled for a long time, they were powerful, and that was evident, etc., it's because they had deserved it in the face of God, right? And therefore that was where literally the imperium laid, in a sense, right? These were people who ruled properly, and if they ruled, it's because God had wanted that. So, and this naturally stemmed from their quality. They had a quality that was connaturated to their own nobilitas proper. In 533, the King Athalric would have indicated to the senators, as a proof of the great considerations that he had for them, the fact that he promoved to the higher functions meant that he had never seen, but being sons of senators, let's say, it was presumed to be worthy of such honor by nature. By nature. Think even during the Middle Ages how important blood is, lineage is. This thing was already there from this mindset. And that comparison with Gaul is interesting, because this was pretty much the same, right? As we've seen in Italy, we don't have much of that example, because as we'll see in other videos, during early medieval times, it was nothing basically like a nobility that lasted for 3 or 4, I mean, somebody was really powerful for 3 or 4 generations as a family. That was after the Gothic War. Before, this system is exactly the one you would think as the most aristocratic one, from which in Gaul would stem also the dynastic ideal of the Merovingian monarchy as such, right? That was unknown to other peoples, such as even the early Franks as such, but just because they had become Gallo-Romans in political culture that began to do this, right? And even in this letter of Athalaric, it's remembered in the end that 2 paths within the senatorial order, that is, the senators grant the favor of cooptation to external people, so they presented their own clients for the emperor, but they are ever more they're ever happier when they thicken the ranks of the order with their own sons. Yet in this same milieu in which the continuity of blood of senatorial aristocracy is exalted, there are also other topics, such as the extinction of the same lineages, or also of the decline, let's say, of the high moral quality of such stocks. That is to say, the non-necessary coincidence between hereditary nobility and virtus. That was the sum of all the virtues, of the Roman virtues within the manhood and command, and that quality that was intrinsic to receive the imperium from God derived, right? So that was the top Roman virtue. And if you were the best, you had to behave like the best. So in the aforementioned recommendation of Importunus, Cassiodorus makes Theodoric exposing the contraposition between an indignia, that is, unworthy posterity, within which is rejected the goodness of the ancient lineage, and of a preclara one that confirms instead with its own virtue the ones of the fathers. And a generation later, the King Theodad, in recommending the patrician Maximus of the Anician gens. It was one of the most, it was probably the single most noble family in the world, at that point, Europe, the Mediterranean. Like, that was the ultra top most, richest, cultured, influential, etc. The true embodiment of, the Italic Roman identity, proper. And he repeats the concept of nobility by birth, and he underlines that such nobility continues, in the case of the Anici, to deserve its name, up to the point which their scions would maintain the probity of their actions. And at the same time, he laments that some other great familiae are literally extinguished at this point. So there's also the problem, naturally, of the biological continuity. So the extinction, in fact, of the lineages, and the necessity that, for the nobiliar quality to be accompanied by an individual virtue, motivate the rhetoric on the opportunity to increase the Senate with homines novi. And this topic of the acquisition of high offices with the rise of social status that rank property, as we've seen, that derives from this, for the merits of the individual. That is a continuous, ongoing fatigue. Work acquires for himself what cannot be achieved by an inexperienced nobility, Cassiodorus writes in one of his Varia. And other, let's say, there is the establishment of other modalities of access for the empty senatorial places, let's say, that are places of senatorial rank that offer also a rhetorical structure to the propose of conferring the laticlavius, that is the senatorial ensign, to a person of non-senatorial family. We read it from the Varia of Cassiodorus still. And it's remembered in them from one side that you can be a nobleman but also poor, or oziosus, as he writes, so that therefore not dramatically involved also in the civil process, and that it's thus important to ensure an elevation of rank by personal merit on this specific base, specifically individual base. There's also the insistence of the importance of the numerositas, so literally the amount, the quantity of the Senate, right, of the senatorial elements, that cannot be achieved entrusting only it to the senatorial children numerically. He writes, for example, this is something that Cassiodorus said, the King Athalaric said on the candidacy of a quaestor, that was illustrious for his forensic eloquence. He says, if antiquity had made you noble, we want that the Senate to be celebrated also for the quantity of its members. That is, so thus you are the seat of the Senate, but for our concession is born who can enter within your ranks. And it would be really important for us to know what was going on between these two methods at the time, because unfortunately we have no idea at the end of the ancient world how much, especially in this one, how much the hereditary and the cooptative system prevailed, or not, how much aristocratic, how much functionarial in the West the elite was, right? The problem is, in fact, we don't have many sources about this at all, right? There is the increasing rarefaction of epigraphy, the shipwreck, the almost total shipwreck of documentary protection, both the private one and the one of public administration. So we cannot analyze such dimension. That of the roughly 200 names of people in senatorial order that are sculpted on the steps of the Colosseum at the time of Odoacer, we don't find more than 30 that known for, through other sources can configure, let's say, consistent prosopography as well. In the letters and formulas of Cassiodorus, even when we can track some functionarial careers and the relative correspondences in increasing rank within a family of ancient aristocracy, the emphasis on a familiar career is higher, right? Also, on the creation of a dynasty of functionaries, we can see what's the time span of it, on which sequence of generations such social affirmation of the individual family had occurred. And such let's say, considerations on the sources have however, some term of comparison. Let's say, as we will see at some point, for the Italian cities of the communal age, we know a lot. Even cities of average importance, such as Imola or Vieta, we know punctually the composition of the councils and of the other collegial offices, as the notary documentation from one side, and even the discontinuous series of estimates and cadastres from the other side allow to represent, in at least some chronological intervals, the patrimonial positions of the residents, the composition of the families, their genealogical story, and also their social dynamics over time. When we look at this wide and powerful Roman Senate of the 5th and the 6th century, we don't even know how many in total these people were. Like the Colosseum steps are surely by itself an important fragmentary evidence, but they do not give us the totality of the senatorial community, right? They're not conceived to tell us that. So there is some prosopography that's been elaborated with difficulties by some scholars that has tried to represent some genealogical trees, and there is too few, right? For no senatorial family of the age of Odoacer Theodoric, we dispose of a list of the estate list, for example, can be compared, for example, to the detailed indications that the registers for the late Middle Ages offer us, even for the small artisans and modest landowners. So we can just here get things right properly from a perspective point of view. First of all, we can look at the number, the general quantity of the senatorial members. It's been proposed that the names sculpted at the Colosseum could represent roughly 1/3 of the total senators. That would place the total quantity thus between 300, 600. Other scholars have instead given a lower estimate. However, we're pretty much sure that the number was sensibly reduced compared to the 2000s that some reliable literary witnesses signal for the second half of the 4th century. Drastically reduced. This had gone in parallel with the general reduction of the Roman population in the 5th century, probably the population of Rome, because of all the sacks. Albeit we should also point out that demographic decline had kind of rendered with the crisis of the middle lower classes had rendered the elites and their concentration even higher and visible than in the past, properly in Rome. Because Rome had lived on. I mean, Rome, up to the Gothic War, is still functioning. It receives these blows because of the barbarian sacks, but it doesn't, things went on pretty much as they had always been. So we can think in general, however, of a few hundreds of individuals, like 200 or 300 familiar nuclei that had a position of preeminence and privilege on a population in Italy that we evaluate in some millions of inhabitants. It's not a banal consideration, because you have literally to think at the numbers here. Few hundred people that basically rule over millions. And consider we're talking about pre-industrial time. So literally the coercive capacity here is so high because of that wealth distribution we were talking about before. These people owned properly all the land, right? This was a process that in the Roman Empire never quite stopped, since the Middle Republic, the wealthier become ever wealthier. There can be other classes that go up and down in here, but at this point the situation has crystallized. As most of the world at that point, like late antiquity is basically about this, and the Middle Ages are basically about this, largely. Even in the least stratified realities, there are always the rise of the elites everywhere. So when we talk specifically about the extension of the dominion of the senatorial aristocracy, we are speaking not just, as we've seen, at the political one. Because, albeit we don't know the analytical description of the estates, we know that the senatorial families had assets still organized in the form of the villa, right? So this great polycultural business, cultivations, and other productions worked by slaves and colonists. And we find it definitely in the Italian territory, so in the Cisalpine, in Gaul, in central and southern Italy, but also and often also across the Alps, right? The Romano-Italic aristocracy had possessions here in the Gauls, in the Noricum, right? It was a spread tied to the frame of the Roman imperial domination that naturally had been eroded over time, considering the disgregation of the same domination. But we're talking about aristocracies that in the past were at that point transcontinental, I mean across the Mediterranean, Europe, Africa, and the Near East, right? The actually most important blow had been especially the Vandal conquest of a part of Mediterranean Africa between 429 and 442 that had compromised the quiet possessions of the senatorial aristocracy in that area, right? And still in Theoderic's time, the great properties of the senatorial or Roman senators were dislocated on large-scale areas, right? That were importantly connected still, and were still a vital commercial traffic. Consider, for example, the Vandals had created this kind of maritime dominion. Most Africa was rich and important, but not as populated, strong as, I don't know, Italy or Spain. So they had gone to piracy, right? They had sacked from the sea. They had seized Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands. Theodoric had actually taken back Sicily, right? Historically, also if you look at here between the late Middle Ages and the early modern age, think about the gens Anita that we were talking about before. Gregory the Great was probably part of it, right? And still the church here was taking many senators would become bishops over the generations, right? And there was a dramatic connection between the Roman Church and Sicily, for example, and even Africa when it was reconquered, right? So that there were interesting dynamics crossing across the two shores of the Mediterranean, that these very fertile lands were quite important even for the survival of the empire. I mean, the Western Empire had basically failed in the moment in which Africa could not be reconquered anymore, right? In the moment in which it was understood that traditional grain supplies couldn't create enough, were cut, and therefore the surplus of Italy alone after Majoranus couldn't support, an imperial policy anymore. I mean, up to that point, it had worked. Majoranus showed it against the Visigoths in Spain. It was, kind of easy to take that back. But if the Vandals had not stood in between, if Gaiseric hadn't opposed even the naval intervention of the Eastern Roman Empire, by the time of the Arab invasions, had they happened, we would have easily seen as still a Western Roman Empire. It wasn't nothing deterministic about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Technically, as we have seen here, that Roman society didn't even fall. I mean, Justinian reconquered these lands. It was still Roman Empire. So it's a matter of perspectives, but it's important to understand what was the glue that kept these things together and these lands together. And it was the senatorial elite and all these major traffics, latifundia, wealth, that they had rationalized over time. They had, used to make this thing work. And it wasn't... even considering the whole background of the story of these lands, such a negative aspect, as we've seen, it was kind of a natural transition towards that. More uncertain is instead what was the structure of senatorial families, right? Because externally we understand it were these traffics, these connections, but what were these families about concretely? Well, usually the literary text, when they talk about the antiquity of the ancestry of this or that character, usually still make a reference to the physiognomy of the gens, that is to say, the vast group of republican times and of the imperial times tied on in part on the blood tie and in part on forms, let's say, of artificial parentage. Those were extended groups, we would think. As we know, there were three names basically that identified the person according to these groups. The second of which was the gentilicial one of the gens that indicated the belonging to that clan. Basically, we can still say with a belonging that was not really, as we've seen, just natural, that is biological parentage, but it could be about adoption, liberation sometimes, the liberation sometimes properly from a servile status. And it was also possible to enter in a gens by receiving a Roman citizenship. There were many barbarians that had married into the highest nobility, famously enough, and they had, been quite. The emperor had this higher privileges of making it work, but it was like at that point working at international level, and these marriages, these ties that had always existed, were kept in existence between barbarians and Romans, right? Because it was needed. So such onomastic system, however, based on the three names, melted away in late antique times. This is quite likely a structural, a symptom of structural change, after which the gens didn't retain the old cohesion and extension. It was a gradual passage, naturally, but we see that even at the elevated levels of society, we have strong doubts that, for example, such important families such as the Decii or the Anici of the 5th and the 6th centuries were organized in something different from a restricted group, because that older clanic form had been the product of a much more dynamic society. Here, literally, if we talk about the hundreds, it's just, a big deal in demographic terms of the time, where everything had contracted. And the same need also for controlling the fewer resources. This is a process that occurs also in later medieval times. Think about the same Italy, I don't know, for the transformation from communal times to seigneurial times, right? Well, the communal clans were quite extended, were hundreds, right, of people. They also had different professions. They were somewhat also distant familiar to them, but because there were many opportunities, and these groups cashed through that. When there is the mid-14th century crisis in Europe, well, resources shrink. Just the most powerful emerge. Very often there is a new need for unity of command, political control. So this also the ruling classes shrink around literally certain individuals that found lineages, dynasties that are the seigneuries as we know. And they are also more elevated in politically, socially, sometimes even internationally. They married into royalty, even if they weren't noble themselves. In the Italian cases, it's quite famous also throughout the modern age. I mean, it's pretty well known in European nobility. And so here it's a bit the same, right? You don't find just properly a lord as we would intend it, but because they're still part of a state, right, of a senate, of a collegial institution, so they're not monarchs, as you know, but they surely are ever more individually relevant in a sense, especially these higher families. They counted on the individual, and that's also where also their pride and their ultra elitistic ethos came from, right? And it's also likely that the end of a gentilicial structure had represented, however, a fragility for the same senatorial aristocracy during the 5th and the 6th century. Albeit, there were other problems, because if the fortune of this elite was funded over the large extension of the Roman state, well, at this point, the same had already lost the size of elements of power on the control of such state and its territory where the estates were, right? If you wonder even why this families pressured so much for the Gothic War, the Eastern Roman intervention, etc. Well, this is because they wanted to be reintegrated into a broader circuit to make more money, to make more, to remain tied to that system, and also to exploit this local superiority, as we were saying before. And there is an aspect that for a military history channel is quite important to consider, that is to say also they needed properly the opportunity to develop a new political and military power, because we have this, in fact, utter prejudice stemming from, the militarized Middle Ages and barbarians with horns and all this stuff, and the civilian and kind of, militarily inept Roman civilian kind of, in fact, aristocracy, etc. Absolutely not. These men were hungry for command. They wanted to carve their own power at command of the Roman army, and they at this point they couldn't do it anymore, because surprise, now it was the Germans that made up the army, and therefore they were losing opportunities on that level. They wanted to be reintegrated into the state, so that had allowed the deployment of such army. Because here properly the field Roman army doesn't exist anymore. Odoacer had been basically the last Roman army had been those Germanic mercenary groups at the head of which Odoacer seized power. Eventually it was the Ostrogoths that were an entire people and made up for this demographically with the manpower, etc. But it wasn't properly a Roman army anymore, right? So as we were saying, demographic resources were important to the Goths again to settle there, to to provide further numbers and strength and cohesion that could specifically also strip other lands, as we've seen Sicily from the Vandals, etc., to make money. And it's not to be given just as anecdotally that the need for a command was crucial for these aristocracies as well, and that they were looking forward to it. Anyhow, for now we stop here. We will keep talking naturally about these dynamics more in depth. We will space a bit more across the Middle Ages, so it's not going to be very continuous, but still, we started. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.